Section 35 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. One evening. The steamboat Kleber had stopped, and I was admiring the beautiful bay of Bougie that was opened out before us. The high hills were covered with forests, and in the distance the yellow sands formed a beach of powdered gold, while the sun shed its fiery rays on the white houses of the town. The warm African breeze blew the odor of that great, mysterious continent into which men of the northern races but rarely penetrate, into my face. For 3 months I had been wandering on the borders of that great, unknown world, on the outskirts of that strange world of the ostrich, the camel, the gazelle, the hippopotamus, the gorilla, the lion, and the tiger, and the Negro. I had seen the Arab galloping like the wind, and passing like a floating standard, and I had slept under those brown tents, the moving habitation of those white birds of the desert, and I felt, as it were, intoxicated with light, with fancy, and with space. But now, after this final excursion, I should have to start to return to France and to Paris, that city of useless chatter, of commonplace cares, and of continual handshaking, and I should bid adieu to all that I had got to like so much, which was so new to me, which I had scarcely had time to see thoroughly, and which I so much regretted to leave. A fleet of small boats surrounded the steamer, and jumping into one rowed by a Negro lad, I soon reached the quay near the old Saracen gate, whose gray ruins at the entrance of the Kabyle town looked like an old escutcheon of nobility. While I was standing by the side of my portmanteau, looking at the great steamer lying at anchor in the roads, and filled with admiration at that unique shore, and that semicircle of hills bathed in blue light, which were more beautiful than those of Ajaccio or of Porto in Corsica, a heavy hand was laid on my shoulder, and on turning round I saw a tall man with a long beard, dressed in white flannel, and wearing a straw hat, standing by my side, and looking at me with his blue eyes. "Are you not an old schoolfellow of mine?" he said. "It is very possible. What is your name?" "Trémoulin." "By Jove, you were in the same class as I was." "Ah, old fellow, I recognized you immediately." He seemed so pleased, so happy at seeing me, that in an outburst of friendly selfishness, I shook both the hands of my former schoolfellow heartily, and felt very pleased at meeting him thus. For 4 years Trémoulin had been one of the best and most intimate school friends, one of those whom we are too apt to forget as soon as we leave. In those days he had been a tall, thin fellow, whose head seemed to be too heavy for his body. It was a large, round head, and hung sometimes to the right, and sometimes to the left, onto his chest. Trémoulin was very clever, however, and had a marvelous aptitude for learning, and had an instinctive intuition for all literary studies, and gained nearly all the prizes in our class. We were fully convinced at school that he would turn out a celebrated man, a poet, no doubt, for he wrote verses, and was full of ingeniously sentimental ideas. His father, who kept a chemist's shop near the Pantheon, was not supposed to be very well off, and I had lost sight of him as soon as he had taken his bachelor's degree, and now I naturally asked him what he was doing there. "I am a planter," he replied. "Bah! You really plant?" "And I have my harvest." "What is it?" "Grapes, from which I make wine." "Is your wine growing a success?" "A great success." "So much the better, old fellow." "Were you going to the hotel?" "Of course I was." "Well, then, you must come home with me instead." "But—" "The matter is settled." And he said to the young Negro, who was watching our movements, "Take that home, Al." And the lad put my portmanteau on his shoulder, and set off, raising the dust with his black feet, while Trémoulin took my arm and led me off. First of all, he asked me about my journey, and what impressions it had had on me, and seeing how enthusiastic I was about it, he seemed to like me better than ever. He lived in an old Moorish house, with an interior courtyard without any windows looking into the street, and commanded by a terrace, which, in its turn, commanded those of the neighboring houses, as well as the bay, and the forests, the hill, and the open sea, and I could not help exclaiming, "Ah, that is what I like! The whole of the East lays hold of me in this place. You are indeed lucky to be living here. What nights you must spend upon that terrace! Do you sleep there?" "Yes, in the summer. We will go on to it this evening. Are you fond of fishing?" "What kind of fishing?" "Fishing by torchlight." "Yes, I am particularly fond of it." "Very well, then, we will go after dinner, and we will come back and drink sherbet on my roof." After I'd had a bath, he took me to see the charming Kabyle town, a veritable cascade of white houses toppling down to the sea. And then, when it was getting dusk, we went in, and after an excellent dinner, we went down to the quay, and we saw nothing except the fires and the stars, those large, bright, scintillating African stars. A boat was waiting for us, and as soon as we had got in, a man whose face I could not distinguish began to row, while my friend was getting ready the brazier which he would light later, and he said to me, "You know, I have a mania for a fish spear, and nobody can handle it better than I can. Allow me to compliment you on your skill." We had rowed round a kind of mole, and now we were in a small bay full of high rocks, whose shadows looked like towers built in the water, and I suddenly perceived that the sea was phosphorescent, and as the oars moved gently, they seemed to light up moving flames, that followed in our wake, and then died out, and I leant over the side of the boat and watched it, as we glided over that glimmer in the darkness. Where were we going to? I could not see my neighbors. In fact, I could see nothing but the luminous ripple and the sparks of water dropping from the oars. It was hot, very hot, and the darkness seemed as hot as a furnace, and this mysterious motion with these two men in that silent boat had a peculiar effect upon me. Suddenly the rower stopped. Where were we? I heard a slight scratching noise close to me, and I saw a hand, nothing but a hand, applying a lighted match to the iron grating, which was fastened over the bows of the boat, which was covered with wood, as if it had been a floating funeral pile, and which was soon blazing brightly and illuminating the boat and the two men, an old, thin, pale, wrinkled sailor with a pocket handkerchief tied round his head, instead of a cap, and Trémoulin, whose fair beard glistened in the light. The other began to row again, while Trémoulin kept throwing wood onto the brazier, which burnt red and brightly. I leant over the side again, and could see the bottom, and a few feet below us there was that strange country of the water, which vivifies plants and animals, just like the air of heaven does. Trémoulin, who was standing in the bows with his body bent forward, and holding the sharp-pointed trident in his hand, was on the lookout, with the ardent gaze of a beast of prey watching for its spoil. And suddenly, with a swift movement, he darted his forked weapon into the sea so vigorously that it secured a large fish swimming near the bottom. It was a conger eel, which managed to wriggle, half dead as it was, into a puddle of the brackish water. Trémoulin again threw his spear, and when he pulled it up, I saw a great lump of red flesh which palpitated, moved, rolled and unrolled, long, strong, soft feelers round the handle of the trident. It was an octopus, and Trémoulin opened his knife, and with a swift movement plunged it between the eyes and killed it. And so our fishing continued until the wood began to run short. When there was not enough left to keep up the fire, Trémoulin dipped the braziers into the sea, and we were again buried in darkness. The old sailor began to row again, slowly and regularly, though I could not tell where the land or where the port was. By and by, however, I saw lights. We were nearing the harbor. "Are you sleepy?" my friend said to me. "Not the slightest." Then we will go and have a chat on the roof. I shall be delighted." Just as we got onto the terrace, I saw the crescent moon rising behind the mountains, and around us the white houses with their flat roofs descending down towards the sea, while human forms were standing or lying on them, sleeping or dreaming under the stars. Whole families wrapped in long gowns and resting in the calm night after the heat of the day. It suddenly seemed to me as if the Eastern mind were taking possession of me, the poetical and legendary spirit of a people with simple and flowery thoughts. My head was full of the Bible and of the Arabian Nights. I could hear the prophets proclaiming miracles, and I could see princesses wearing silk drawers on the roofs of the palaces, while delicate perfumes, whose smoke assumed the forms of genii, were burning on silver dishes. And I said to Trémoulin, "You are very fortunate in living here." "I came here quite by accident," he replied. "By accident?" "Yes, accident and unhappiness brought me here." "You have been unhappy?" "Very unhappy." He was standing in front of me, wrapped in his bournous, and his voice had such a painful ring in it that it almost made me shiver. After a moment's silence, he continued, "I will tell you what my troubles have been. Perhaps it will do me good to speak about them." "Let me hear them." "Do you really wish it?" "Yes." "Very well, then. You remember what I was at school, a sort of poet, brought up in a chemist's shop. I dreamt of writing books, and I tried it after taking my degree, but I did not succeed. I published a volume of verse, and then a novel, and neither of them sold. And then I wrote a play, which was never acted. Next, I lost my heart, but I will not give you an account of my passion. Next door to my father's shop there was a tailor's, who had a daughter, with whom I fell in love. She was very clever, and had obtained her certificates for higher education, and her mind was bright and active, quite in keeping indeed with her body. She might have been taken for 15, although she was 22. She was very small, with delicate features, outlines and tints, just like some beautiful water color. Her nose, her mouth, her blue eyes, her light hair, her smile, her waist, her hands, all looked as if they were fit for a stained window, and not for everyday life. But she was lively, supple, and incredibly active, and I was very much in love with her. I remember 2 or 3 walks in the Luxembourg garden, near the Medici's fountain, which were certainly the happiest hours of my life. I dare say you have known that foolish condition of tender madness which causes us to think of nothing but of acts of adoration. One really becomes possessed, haunted by a woman, and nothing exists for us by the side of her. We soon became engaged, and I told her my projects of the future, which she did not approve of. She did not believe that I was either a poet, a novelist, or a dramatic author, and thought a prosperous business could afford perfect happiness. So I gave up the idea of writing books, and resigned myself to selling them, and I bought a bookseller's business at Marseilles, the owner of which had just died. I had 3 very prosperous years. We had made our shop into a sort of literary drawing room, where all the men of letters in the town used to come and talk. They came in as if it had been a club, and exchanged ideas on books, on poets, and especially on politics. My wife, who took a very active part in the business, enjoyed quite a reputation in the town. But as for me, while they were all talking downstairs, I was working in my studio upstairs, which communicated with the shop by a winding staircase. I could hear their voices, their laughter, and their discussions, and sometimes I left off writing in order to listen. I kept in my own room to write a novel, which I never finished. The more regular frequenters of the shop were Monsieur Montina, a man of good private means, a tall, handsome man, like one meets with in the south of France, with an olive skin and dark, expressive eyes; Monsieur Barbet, a magistrate; 2 merchants, who were partners, Messrs. Faucil and Labarègue; and General the Marquis de la Flèche, the head of the Royalist party, the principal man in the whole district, an old fellow of 66. My business prospered, and I was happy, very happy. One day, however, about 3 o'clock, when I was out on business, I was going through the Rue Saint-Ferréol. I suddenly saw a woman come out of a house whose figure and appearance were so much like my wife's that I should have said to myself, "There she is," if I had not left her in the shop half an hour before, suffering from a headache. She was walking quickly on before me, without turning round, and in spite of myself I followed her, as I felt surprised and uneasy. I said to myself, "It is she. No, it is quite impossible, as she has a sick headache. And then, what could she have to do in that house?" However, as I wished to have the matter cleared up, I made haste after her. I do not know whether she felt or guessed that I was behind her, or whether she recognized my step, but she turned round suddenly. It was she. When she saw me, she grew very red and stopped, and then with a smile she said, "Oh, here you are." I felt choking. "Yes, so you have come out? And how is your headache?" "It is better, and I have been out on an errand." "Where?" "To La Cassade's in the Rue Cassinelli, to order some pencils." She looked me full in the face. She was not flushed now, but rather pale, on the contrary. Her clear, limpid eyes, those women's eyes, appeared to be full of truth, but I felt vaguely and painfully that they were full of lies. I was much more confused and embarrassed than she was herself, without venturing to suspect, but sure that she was lying, though I did not know why, and so I merely said, "You were quite right to go out, if you felt better." "Oh, yes, my head is much better." "Are you going home?" "Yes, of course I am." I left her, and wandered about the streets by myself. What was going on? While I was talking to her, I had an intuitive feeling of her falseness, but now I could not believe that it was so, and when I returned home to dinner, I was angry for having suspected her, even for a moment. Have you ever been jealous? It does not matter whether you have or not, but the first drop of jealousy had fallen into my heart, and that is always like a spark of fire. It did not formulate anything, and I did not think anything. I only knew that she had lied. You must remember that every night, after the customers and clerks had left, we were alone, and either strolled as far as the harbor when it was fine, or remained talking in my office if the weather was bad. And I used to open my heart to her without any reserve, because I loved her. She was part of my life, the greater part, and all my happiness. And in her small hands she held my trusting, faithful heart captive. During those first days, those days of doubt, and before my suspicions increased and assumed a precise shape, I felt as depressed and chilly as when we are going to be seriously ill. I was continually cold, really cold, and could neither eat nor sleep. Why had she told me a lie? What was she doing in that house? I went there to try and find out something, but I could discover nothing. The man who rented the first floor, and who was an upholsterer, had told me all about his neighbors, but without helping me the least. A midwife had lived on the second floor, a dressmaker and a manicure and chiropodist on the third, and 2 coachmen and their families in the attics. Why had she told me a lie? It would have been so easy for her to have said that she had been to the dressmakers or the chiropodists. Oh, how I longed to question them also! I did not say so for fear that she might guess my suspicions. One thing, however, was certain: she had been into that house, and had concealed the fact from me, so there was some mystery in it. But what? At one moment I thought there might be some laudable purpose in it, some charitable deed that she wished to hide, some information which she wished to obtain, and I found fault with myself for suspecting her. Have not all of us the right of our little innocent secrets, a kind of second interior life for which one ought not to be responsible to anybody? Can a man, because he has taken a girl to be his companion through life, demand that she shall neither think nor do anything without telling him, either before or afterwards? Does the word marriage mean renouncing all liberty and independence? Was it not possible that she was going to the dressmaker's without telling me, or that she was going to assist the family of one of the coachmen? Or she might have thought that I might criticize, if not blame, her visit to the house. She knew me thoroughly, and my slightest peculiarities, and perhaps she feared a discussion, even if she did not think that I should find fault with her. She had very pretty hands, and I ended by supposing that she was having them secretly attended to by the manicure in the house, which I suspected, and that she did not tell me of it for fear that I should think her extravagant. She was very methodical and economical, and looked after all her household duties most carefully, and no doubt she thought that she should lower herself in my eyes were she to confess that slight piece of feminine extravagance. Women have very many subtleties and innate tricks in their soul. But none of my own arguments reassured me. I was jealous, and I felt that my suspicion was affecting me terribly, that I was being devoured by it. I felt secret grief and anguish, and a thought which I still veiled, and I did not dare to lift the veil, for beneath it I should find a terrible doubt. A lover. Had not she a lover? It was unlikely, impossible, a mere dream. And yet? I continually saw Montina's face before my eyes. I saw the tall, silly-looking, handsome man with his bright hair smiling into her face, and I said to myself, he is the one. I concocted a story of their intrigues. They had talked a book over together, had discussed the love ventures it contained, had found something in it that resembled them, and they had turned that analogy into reality. And so I watched them, a prey to the most terrible sufferings that a man can endure. I bought shoes with india rubber soles so that I might be able to walk about the house without making any noise, and I spent half my time in going up and down my little spiral staircase in the hope of surprising them, but I always found that the clerk was with them. I lived in a constant state of suffering. I could no longer work nor attend to my business. As soon as I went out, as soon as I had walked 100 yards along the street, I said to myself, he is there. And when I found he was not there, I went out again. But almost immediately I went back again, thinking, he has come now, and that went on every day. At night it was still worse, for I felt her by my side in bed asleep, or pretending to be asleep. Was she really sleeping? No, most likely not. Was that another lie? I remained motionless on my back, hot from the warmth of her body, panting and tormented. Oh, how intensely I longed to get up, to get a hammer and to split her head open, so as to be able to see inside it. I knew that I should have seen nothing except what is to be found in every head, and I should have discovered nothing, for that would have been impossible. And her eyes! When she looked at me, I felt furious with rage. I looked at her. She looked at me. Her eyes were transparent, candid, and false. False. Nobody could tell what she was thinking of, and I felt inclined to run pins into them and to destroy those mirrors of falseness. Ah, how well I could understand the Inquisition! I would have applied the torture, the boot. Speak, confess. You will not? Then wait. And I would have seized her by the throat until I choked her, or else I would have held her fingers into the fire. Oh, how I should have enjoyed doing it! Speak, speak! You will not? I would have held them on the coals, and when the tips were burnt, she would have confessed. Certainly she would have confessed. Trémoulin was sitting up, shouting with clenched fists. Around us, on the neighboring roofs, people awoke and sat up, as he was disturbing their sleep. As for me, I was moved and powerfully interested, and in the darkness I could see that little woman, that little fair, lively, artful woman, as if I had known her personally. I saw her selling her books, talking with the men whom her childish ways attracted, and in her delicate, doll-like head I could see little crafty ideas, silly ideas, the dreams which a milliner smelling of musk attached to all heroes of romantic adventures. I suspected her just like he did. I hated and detested her, and would willingly have burnt her fingers and made her confess. Presently he continued more calmly. I do not know why I have told you all this, for I have never mentioned it to anyone, but then I have not seen anybody or spoken to anybody for 2 years, and it was seething in my heart like a fermenting wine. I have got rid of it, and so much the worse for you. Well, I had made a mistake, but it was worse than I thought, much worse. Just listen. I employed the means which a man always does under such circumstances, and pretended that I was going to be away from home for a day, and whenever I did this, my wife went out to lunch. I need not tell you how I bribed a waiter in the restaurant to which they used to go, so that I might surprise them. He was to open the door of their private room for me, and I arrived at the appointed time with the fixed determination of killing them both. I could see the whole scene, just as if it had already occurred. I could see myself going in. A small table covered with glasses, bottles, and plates separated her from Montina, and they would be so surprised when they saw me that they would not even attempt to move. And without a word, I should bring down the loaded stick which I had in my hand on the man's head. Killed by one blow, he would fall with his head on the table, and then turning towards her, I should leave her time, a few moments, to understand it all, and to stretch out her arms towards me, mad with terror, before dying in her turn. Oh, I was ready, strong, determined, and pleased, madly pleased at the idea. The idea of the terrified look that she would throw at my raised stick, of her arms that she would stretch out to me, of her horrified cry, of her livid and convulsed looks, avenged me beforehand. I would not kill her at one blow. You will think me cruel, I dare say, but you do not know what a man suffers. To think that a woman, whether she be wife or mistress, whom one loves, gives herself to another, yields herself up to him as she does to you, and receives kisses from his lips, as she does from yours. It is terrible, an atrocious thing to think of. When one feels that torture, one is ready for anything. I only wonder that more women are not murdered, for every man who has been deceived longs to commit murder, has dreamt of it in the solitude of his own room, or on a deserted road, and has been haunted by the one fixed idea of satisfied vengeance. I arrived at the restaurant, and asked whether they were there. The waiter whom I had bribed replied, "Yes, monsieur," and taking me upstairs, he pointed to a door, and said, "That is the room." So I grasped my stick, as if my fingers had been made of iron, and went in. I had chosen a most appropriate moment, for they were kissing most lovingly, but it was not Montina, it was General de la Flèche, who was 66 years old, and I had so fully made up my mind that I should find the other one there, I was motionless from astonishment. And then, I really do not quite know what I thought. No, I really do not know. If I had found myself face to face with the other, I should have been convulsed with rage, but on seeing this old man with a fat stomach and pendulous cheeks, I was nearly choked with disgust. She, who did not look 15, small and slim as she was, had given herself to this fat man who was nearly paralyzed, because he was a marquis, and a general, the friend and representative of dethroned kings. No, I do not know what I felt, nor what I thought. I could not have lifted my hand against this old man. It would have been a disgrace to me, and I no longer felt inclined to kill my wife, but all women who could be guilty of such things. I was no longer jealous, but felt distracted, as if I had seen the horror of horrors. Let people say what they like of men, they are not so vile as that. If a man is known to have given himself up to an old woman in that fashion, people point their fingers at him. The husband or lover of an old woman is more despised than a thief. We men are a decent lot, as a rule, But many women, especially in Paris, are absolutely bad. They will give themselves to all men, old or young, from the most contemptible and different motives, because it is their profession, their vocation, and their function. They are the eternal, unconscious, and serene prostitutes who give up their bodies because they are the merchandise of love, which they sell or give to the old man who frequents the pavements with money in his pocket, or else for glory, to a lecherous old king, or to a celebrated and disgusting old man. He vociferated like a prophet of old, in a furious voice, under the starry sky, and with the rage of a man in despair, he repeated all the glorified disgrace of all the mistresses of old kings, the respectable shame of all those virgins who marry old husbands, the tolerated disgrace of all those young women who accept old kisses with a smile. I could see them, as he evoked their memory since the beginning of the world, surging round us in that Eastern night, girls, beautiful girls, with vile souls, who, like the lower animals, who know nothing of the age of the male, are docile to senile desires. They rose up before one, the handmaids of the patriarchs, who are mentioned in the Bible: Hagar, Ruth, the daughters of Lot, Abigail, Abishag, the virgin of Shunem, who reanimated David with her caresses when he was dying, and the others, young, stout, white patricians or plebeians, irresponsible females belonging to a master, and submissive slaves, whether caught by the attraction of royalty or bought as slaves. "What did you do?" I asked. "I went away," he replied simply. And we remained sitting side by side for a long time, without speaking, only dreaming. I have retained an impression of that evening that I can never forget. All that I saw, felt, and heard, our fishing excursion, the octopus also, perhaps that harrowing story amidst those white figures on the neighboring roofs, all seemed to concur in producing a unique sensation. Certain meetings, certain inexplicable combinations of things, decidedly contain a larger quantity of the secret quintessence of life than that which is spread over the ordinary events of our days, without anything exceptional happening to them. End of section 35. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 33 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Hermaphrodite. "Upon my word, I laughed at it as much as the rest," Navarrete exclaimed. "I laughed at it with that profound, cruel pitilessness, which we, all of us, who are well made and vigorous, feel for those whom their stepmother, Nature, has disfigured in some way or other, for those laughable, feeble creatures who are, however, more to be pitied than those poor, deformed wretches from whom we turn away in spite of ourselves. I had been the first to make fun of him at the club, to find those easy words which are remembered, and to turn that smooth, flabby, pink, ugly face like that of an old woman, and of a Levantine eunuch, in which the mouth is like a piece of inert flesh, and where the small eyes glisten with concentrated cunning and remind us of the watchful, angry eyes of a gorilla at the same time, into ridicule. I knew that he was selfish, without any affection, unreliable, full of whims, turning like a weathercock with every wind that blows, and caring for nothing in the world except gambling and old Dresden china. However, our intercourse was invariably limited to a careless good morning, and to the usual shake of hands which men exchange when they meet at the theater or the club, and so I had neither to defend him nor to uphold him as a friend. But I can swear to you that now I reproach myself for all these effusive jeers and bitter things, and they weigh on my conscience now that I have been told the other side, the equivocal enigma of that existence. "A Punch and Judy secret," Bob Shelley said, throwing the end of his cigar into the fire. "Oh yes, we were 100 miles from the truth when we merely supposed that he was unfit for service. This unhappy Lantosque, a well-born, clever man, and very rich to boot, might have exhibited himself in some traveling booth, for he was an hermaphrodite. Do you understand? An hermaphrodite. And his whole life was one of long, incessant torture, of physical and moral suffering, which was more maddening than that which Tantalus endured on the banks of the river Acheron. He had nearly everything of the woman about him. He was a ridiculous caricature of our sex, with his shrill voice, his large hips, his bust concealed by a loose, wide coat, his cheeks, his chin and upper lip without a vestige of hair. And he had to appear like a man, to restrain and stifle his instincts, his tastes, desires, and dreams, to fight ceaselessly against himself, and never to allow anything of that which he endured, nor what he longed for, nor that which was sapping his very life, to be discovered. Once only he was on the point of betraying himself, in spite of himself. He ardently loved a man, as Chloe must have loved Daphne. He could not master himself or calm his feverish passion, and went towards the abyss as if seized by mental giddiness. He could imagine nothing handsomer, more desirable, or more charming than that chance friend. He had sudden transports, fits of surprise, tenderness, curiosity, jealousy, the ardent longings of an old maid who is afraid of dying a virgin, who is waiting for love as for her deliverance, who attaches herself and devotes herself to a lover with her whole being, and who grows emaciated and dries up, and remains misunderstood and despised. And as they have both disappeared now, the lover dead from a sword thrust to the middle of the chest at Milan, on account of some ballet girl, and as he certainly died without knowing that he had inspired such a passion, I may tell you his name. He was Count Sebinico, who used to deal at faro with such delicate white hands, and who wore rings on nearly every finger, who had such a musical voice, and who, with his wavy hair and his delicate profile, looked like a handsome Florentine condottiere. It must be very terrible to be thus ashamed of oneself, to have that longing for kisses which console the most wretched in their misery, which satisfy hunger and thirst and assuage pain, that illusion of delicious, intoxicating kisses, the delight and the balm of which such a person can never know, the horror of that dishonor of being pointed at, made fun of, driven away like unclean creatures that prostitute their sex, and make love vile by unmentionable rites. Oh, the constant bitterness of seeing that person we love makes fun of us, ill-uses us, and does not show us even the slightest friendship. Poor devil, Jean d'Orthez said, in a sad and moved voice. In his place I should have blown my brains out. Everybody says that, my dear fellow, but how few there are who venture to forestall that intruder, who always come too quickly. Lantosque had splendid health, and declared that he had never put a penny into a doctor's pocket, and if he had allowed himself to have been looked after when he was confined to his bed 2 months before, by an attack of influenza, we should still be hearing him propose a game of poker before dinner in his shrill voice. His death, however, was as tragic and mysterious as all those tales from beyond the grave are, on which the invisible rests. Although he had a cough which threatened to tear his chest to pieces, and although he was haunted by the fear of death, of that great depth of darkness in which we lose ourselves in the abyss of annihilation and oblivion, he obstinately refused to have his chest sounded, and repulsed Dr. Pertuzet almost furiously, who thought he had gone out of his mind. He cowered down and covered himself with the bedclothes up to his chin, and found strength enough to tear up the prescriptions, and to drive everyone, whether friend or relation, who tried to make him listen to reason, and who could not understand his attacks of rage and neurosis, from his bedside. He seemed to be possessed by some demon, like those women in hysterical convulsions, whom the bishops used formerly to exorcise with much pomp. It was painful to see him. That went on for a week, during which time the pneumonia had ample opportunities for ravaging and giving the finishing stroke to his body, which had been so robust and free from ailments hitherto, and he died, trying to utter some last words which nobody understood, and endeavoring to point out one particular article of furniture in the room. His nearest relation was a cousin, the Marquis de Territé, a skeptic who lived in Burgundy, and whom all this disturbance had upset in his habits, and whose only desire was to get it all over, the legal formalities, the funeral, and all the rest of it, as soon as possible. Without reflecting on the strange suggestiveness of that deathbed, and without looking to see whether there might not be, somehow or other, a will in which Lantosque expressed his last wishes, he wanted to spare his corpse the contact of mercenary hands, and to lay him out himself. You may judge of his surprise when, on throwing back the bedclothes, he first of all saw Lantosque was dressed from head to foot in tights, which accentuated rather than otherwise his female form. Much alarmed, feeling that he must have been violating some supreme order, and comprehending it all, he went to his cousin's writing table, opened it, and successively searched every drawer, and soon found an envelope fastened with 5 seals and addressed to him. He broke them and read as follows, written on a sheet of black-edged paper: "This is my only will. I leave all that I possess to my cousin, Roland de Territé, on condition that he will undertake my funeral, that in his own presence he will have me wrapped up in the sheets of the bed on which I die, and have me put into the coffin so, without any further preparations. I wish to be cremated at Père Lachaise, and not to be subjected to any examination or post mortem, whatever may happen." "And how came the Marquis to betray the secret?" Bob Shelley asked. "The Marquis is married to a charming Parisian woman, and was any married man who loved his wife ever known to keep a secret from her?" End of section 36. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 37 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Marroca. You ask me, my dear friend, to send you my impressions of Africa, my adventures, and especially an account of my love affairs in this country, which has attracted me for so long. You laughed a great deal beforehand at my dusky sweethearts, as you called them, and declared that you could see me returning to France, followed by a tall, ebony-colored woman, with a yellow silk handkerchief round her head, and wearing voluminous, bright-colored trousers. No doubt the Moorish women will have their turn, for I have seen several of them who have made me feel very much inclined to have to fall in love with them, but by way of making a beginning, I came across something better, and very original. In your last letter to me, you say, "When I know how people love in a country, I know that country well enough to describe it, although I may never have seen it. Let me tell you, then, that here they love furiously. From the very first moment, one feels a sort of trembling ardor, of constant desire, to the very tips of the fingers, which overexcites our amorous powers, and all our faculties of physical sensation, from the simple contact of the hands, down to that unnameable requirement which makes us commit so many follies. Do not misunderstand me. I do not know whether you call love of the heart, love of the soul, whether sentimental idealism, platonic love, in a word, can exist on this earth. I doubt it myself. But that other love, sensual love, which has something good, a great deal of good about it, is really terrible in this climate. The heat, the burning atmosphere which makes you feverish, those suffocating blasts of wind from the south, those waves of fire which come from the desert, which is so near us, that oppressive scirocco, which is more destructive and withering than fire, that perpetual conflagration of an entire continent, that is burnt even to its stones by a fierce and devouring sun, inflame the blood, excite the flesh, and makes brutes of us. But to come to my story, I shall not tell you about the beginning of my stay in Africa. After going to Bona, Constantine, Biskra, and Sétif, I went to Bougie through the defiles of Chabet, by an excellent road through a large forest, which follows the sea at a height of 600 feet above it, as far as that wonderful bay of Bougie, which is as beautiful as that of Naples, of Ajaccio, or of Douarnenez, which are the most lovely that I know. Far away in the distance, before one goes round the large inlet where the water is perfectly calm, one sees the Bougie. It is built on the steep sides of a high hill, which is covered with trees, and forms a white spot on that green slope. It might almost be taken for the foam of a cascade falling into the sea. I had no sooner set foot in that delightful small town than I knew that I should stay for a long time. In all directions the eye rests on rugged, strangely shaped hilltops, which are so close together that one can hardly see the open sea, so that the gulf looks like a lake. The blue water is wonderfully transparent, and the azure sky, a deep azure, as if it had received 2 coats of paint, expands its wonderful beauty above it. They seem to be looking at themselves in a glass, and to be a reflection of each other. Bougie is a town of ruins, and on the quay, when one arrives, one sees such a magnificent ruin that one might imagine one was at the opera. It is the old Saracen gate, overgrown with ivy, and there are ruins in all directions on the hills round the town, fragments of Roman walls, bits of Saracen monuments, the remains of Arabic buildings. I had taken a small Moorish house in the upper town. You know those dwellings, which have been described so often. They have no windows on the outside, but they are lighted from top to bottom by an inner court. On the first floor they have a large, cool room in which one spends the days, and a terrace on the roof on which one spends the nights. I at once fell in with the custom of all hot countries, that is to say, of having a siesta after lunch. That is the hottest time in Africa, the time when one can scarcely breathe, when the streets, the fields, and the long, dazzling white roads are deserted, when everyone is asleep, or, at any rate, trying to sleep, attired as scantily as possible. In my drawing room, which had columns of Arabic architecture, I had placed a large, soft couch, covered with a carpet from Jebel Amour, very nearly in the costume of a San, but I could not sleep, as I was tortured by my continence. There are 2 forms of torture on this earth, which I hope you will never know, the want of water and the want of women, and I do not know which is the worst. In the desert, men would commit any infamy for the sake of a glass of clean, cold water, and what would one not do in some of the towns of the littoral for a handsome, fleshy, healthy girl, for there is no lack of girls in Africa. On the contrary, they abound. But to continue my comparison, they are as unwholesome and decayed as the muddy waters in the wells of Sahara. Well, one day, when I was feeling more enervated than usual, I was trying in vain to close my eyes. My legs twitched, as if they were being pricked, and I tossed about uneasily on my couch, until at last, unable to bear it any longer, I got up and went out. It was a terribly hot day, in the middle of July, and the pavement was hot enough to bake bread on. My shirt, which was soaked with perspiration immediately, clung to my body, and on the horizon there was a slight white vapor, which seemed to be palpable heat. I went down to the sea, and going round the port, I went along the shore of the pretty bay where the baths are. There was nobody about, and nothing was stirring. Not a sound of bird or of beast was to be heard. The very waves did not lap, and the sea appeared to be asleep in the sun. Suddenly, behind one of the rocks, which were half covered by the silent water, I heard a slight movement, and on turning round I saw a tall, naked girl, sitting up to her breasts in the water, taking a bath. No doubt she reckoned on being alone at that hot period of the day. Her head was turned towards the sea, and she was moving gently up and down without seeing me. Nothing could be more surprising than that picture of the beautiful woman in the water, which was as clear as crystal under a blaze of light, for she was a marvelously beautiful woman, tall and modeled like a statue. She turned round, uttered a cry, and half swimming, half walking, she went and hid altogether behind her rock. But as she must necessarily come out, I sat down on the beach and waited. Presently she just showed her head, which was covered with thick black plaits. She had a rather large mouth, with full lips, large bold eyes, and her skin, which was rather tanned by the climate, looked like a piece of old, hard, polished ivory. She called out to me, "Go away," and her full voice, which corresponded to her strong build, had a guttural accent, and as I did not move, she added, "It is not right of you to stop there, monsieur." I did not move, however, and her head disappeared. 10 minutes passed, and then her hair, then her forehead, and then her eyes reappeared, but slowly and prudently, as if she were playing at hide and seek, and were looking to see who was near. This time she was furious, and called out, "You will make me get some illness, and I shall not come out as long as you are there." Thereupon I got up and went away, but not without looking round several times. When she thought I was far enough off, she came out of the water. Bending down and turning her back to me, she disappeared in a cavity in the rock, behind a petticoat that was hanging up in front of it. I went back the next day. She was bathing again, but she had a bathing costume, and she began to laugh and showed her white teeth. A week later we were friends, and in another week we were eager lovers. Her name was Marroca, and she pronounced it as if there were a dozen R's in it. She was the daughter of Spanish colonists, and had married a Frenchman whose name was Pontabese. He was in government employ, though I never exactly knew what his functions were. I found out that he was always very busy, and I did not care for anything else. She then altered her time for having her bath, and came to my house every day to have a siesta there. What a siesta! It could scarcely be called reposing. She was a splendid girl, of a somewhat animal but superb type. Her eyes were always glowing with passion, her half-open mouth, her sharp teeth, and even her smiles had something ferociously loving about them, and her curious, long and straight breasts, which were as pointed as if they had been pears of flesh, and as elastic as if they contained steel springs, gave her whole body something of the animal, made her a sort of inferior and magnificent being, a creature who was destined for unbridled love, and which roused in me the idea of those ancient deities who gave expression to their tenderness on the grass and under the trees. And then her mind was as simple as 2 and 2 are 4, and a sonorous laugh served her instead of thought. Instinctively proud of her beauty, she hated the slightest covering, and ran and frisked about my house with daring and unconscious immodesty. When she was at last overcome and worn out by her cries and movements, she used to sleep soundly and peacefully, while the overwhelming heat brought out minute spots of perspiration on her brown skin and from under her arms. Sometimes she returned in the evening when her husband was on duty somewhere, and we used to lie on the terrace, scarcely covered by some fine, gauzy Oriental fabric. When the full moon lit up the town and the gulf, with its surrounding frame of hills, we saw on all the other terraces what looked like an army of silent phantoms lying, who would occasionally get up, change their places, and lie down again in the languorous warmths of the starry sky. But in spite of the brightness of African nights, Marroca would insist on stripping herself almost naked in the clear rays of the moon. She did not trouble herself much about anybody who might see us, and often, in spite of my fears and entreaties, she uttered long, resounding cries, which made the dogs in the distance howl. One night, when I was sleeping under the starry sky, she came and knelt down on my carpet, and putting her lips, which curled slightly, close to my face, she said, "You must come and stay at my house." I did not understand her, and asked, "What do you mean?" "Yes, when my husband has gone away, you must come and be with me." I could not help laughing, and said, "Why, as you come here." And she went on almost talking into my mouth, sending her hot breath into my throat, and moistening my mustache with her lips. I want it as a remembrance. Still, I did not grasp her meaning. She put her arms round my neck. "When you are no longer here, I shall think of it." I was touched and amused at the same time, and said, "You must be mad. I would much rather stop here." As a matter of fact, I have no liking for assignations under the conjugal roof. They are mouse traps, in which the unwary are always caught. But she begged and prayed, and even cried, and at last said, "You shall see how I will love you there." Her wish seemed so strange that I could not explain it to myself, but on thinking it over, I thought I could discern a profound hatred for her husband, the secret vengeance of a woman who takes a pleasure in deceiving him, and who, moreover, wishes to deceive him in his own house. "Is your husband very unkind to you?" I asked her. She looked vexed, and said, "Oh, no, he is very kind." "But you are not fond of him?" She looked at me with astonishment in her large eyes. "Indeed, I am very fond of him, very, but not so fond as I am of you." I could not understand it all, and while I was trying to get at her meaning, she pressed one of those kisses, whose power she knew so well, onto my lips, and whispered, "But you will come, will you not?" I resisted, however, and so she got up immediately and went away, nor did she come back for a week. On the 8th day she came back, stopped gravely at the door of my room, and said, "Are you coming to my house tonight? If you refuse, I shall go away." 8 days is a very long time, my friend, and in Africa those 8 days are as good as a month. "Yes," I said, and opened my arms, and she threw herself into them. At night she waited for me in a neighboring street, and took me to their house, which was very small, and near the harbor. I first of all went through the kitchen, where they had their meals, and then into a very tidy, whitewashed room, with photographs on the walls, and paper flowers under a glass case. Marroca seemed beside herself with pleasure, and she jumped about and said, "There, you are at home now." And I certainly acted as though I had been, though I felt rather embarrassed and somewhat uneasy. Suddenly a loud knocking at the door made us start, and a man's voice called out, "Marroca, it is I." She started. "My husband! Here, hide under the bed quickly." I was distractedly looking for my overcoat, but she gave me a push, and panted out, "Come along, come along." I lay down flat on my stomach, and crept under the bed without a word, while she went into the kitchen. I heard her open a cupboard, and then shut it again, and she came back into the room carrying some object which I could not see, but which she quickly put down, and as her husband was getting impatient, she said calmly, "I cannot find the matches." Then suddenly she added, "Oh, here they are. I will come and let you in." The man came in, and I could see nothing of him but his feet, which were enormous. If the rest of him was in proportion, he must have been a giant. I heard kisses, a little pat on her naked flesh, and a laugh, and he said in a strong Marseilles accent, "I forgot my purse, so I was obliged to come back. You were sound asleep, I suppose?" He went to the cupboard, and was a long time in finding what he wanted, and as Marroca had thrown herself onto a bed, as if she were tired out, he went up to her, and no doubt tried to caress her, for she flung a volley of angry R's at him. His feet were so close to me that I felt a stupid, inexplicable longing to catch hold of them, but I restrained myself, and when he saw that he could not succeed in his wish, he got angry and said, "You are not at all nice tonight. Good bye." I heard another kiss, Then the big feet turned, and I saw the nails in the soles of his shoes as he went into the next room. The front door was shut, and I was saved. I came slowly out of my retreat, feeling rather humiliated, and while Marroca danced a jig round me, shouting with laughter and clapping her hands, I threw myself heavily into a chair. But I jumped up with a bound, for I had sat down on something cold, and as I was no more dressed than my accomplice was, the contact made me start, and I looked round. I had sat down on a small axe, used for cutting wood, and as sharp as a knife. How had it got there? I had certainly not seen it when I went in. But Marroca, seeing me jump up, nearly choked with laughter, and coughed with both hands on her stomach. I thought her amusement rather out of place. We had risked our lives stupidly, and I still felt a cold shiver down my back, and I was rather hurt at her foolish laughter. "Supposing your husband had seen me," I said. "There was no danger of that," she replied. "What do you mean, no danger? That is a good joke. If he had stooped down, he must have seen me." She did not laugh any more. She only looked at me with her large eyes, which were bright with merriment. "He would not have stopped." "Why?" I persisted. "Just suppose that he had let his hat fall. He would have been sure to pick it up, and then I was well prepared to defend myself, in this costume." She put her two strong round arms about my neck, and lowering her voice, as she did when she said, "I adore you," she whispered, "Then he would never have got up again." I did not understand her, and said, "What do you mean?" She gave me a cunning wink, and put out her hand to the chair on which I had sat down, and her outstretched hands, her smile, her half opened lips, her white, sharp, and ferocious teeth, all drew my attention to the little axe which was used for cutting wood, whose sharp blade was glistening in the candlelight, and while she put out her hand as if she were going to take it, she put her left arm round me, and drawing me to her, and putting her lips against mine, with her right arm she made a motion as if she were cutting off the head of a kneeling man. This, my friend, is the manner in which people here understand conjugal duties, love, and hospitality. End of section 37. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 38 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 38. An Artifice. The old doctor and his young patient were talking by the side of the fire. There was nothing the matter with her, except that she had one of those little feminine ailments which pretty women frequently suffer: slight anemia, nervous attack, and a suspicion of fatigue, of that fatigue from which newly married people often suffer at the end of the first month of their married life, when they have made a love match. She was lying on the couch and talking. "No, doctor," she said, "I shall never be able to understand a woman deceiving her husband, even allowing that she does not love him, that she pays no heed to her vows and promises. How can she give herself to another man? How can she conceal the intrigue from other people's eyes? How can it be possible to love amidst lies and treason?" The doctor smiled and replied, "It is perfectly easy, and I can assure you that a woman does not think of all those little subtle details when she has made up her mind to go astray. I even feel certain that no woman is ripe for true love until she has passed through all the promiscuousness and all the loathsomeness of married life, which, according to an illustrious man, is nothing but an exchange of ill-tempered words by day and disagreeable odors at night. Nothing is more true, for no woman can love passionately until after she is married. As for dissimulation, all women have plenty of it on hand on such occasions, and the simplest of them are wonderful, and extricate themselves from the greatest dilemmas in an extraordinary way." The young woman, however, seemed incredulous. "No, doctor," she said. "One never thinks, until after it has happened, of what one ought to have done in a dangerous affair, and women are certainly more liable than men to lose their heads on such occasions." The doctor raised his hands. "After it has happened, you say? Now I will tell you something that happened to one of my female patients, whom I always considered as an immaculate woman. It happened in a provincial town, and one night, when I was sleeping profoundly, in that deep first sleep from which it is so difficult to arouse us, it seemed to me, in my dreams, as if the bells in the town were sounding a fire alarm, and I woke up with a start. It was my own bell which was ringing wildly, and as my footman did not seem to be answering the door, I, in turn, pulled the bell at the head of my bed, and soon I heard banging and steps in the silent house. And then Jean came into my room and handed me a letter which said, 'Madame Lelièvre begs Dr. Simeon to come to her immediately.' I thought for a few moments, and then I said to myself, 'A nervous attack. Vapors. Nonsense. I am too tired.' And so I replied, 'As Dr. Simeon is not at all well, he must beg Madame Lelièvre to be kind enough to call in his colleague, Monsieur Bonnet.' I put the note into an envelope and went to sleep again. But about half an hour later the street bell rang again, and Jean came to me and said, 'There is somebody downstairs. I do not quite know whether it is a man or a woman, as the individual is so wrapped up, who wishes to speak to you immediately. He says it is a matter of life and death for two people.' Whereupon I sat up in bed and told him to show the person in. A kind of black phantom appeared, who raised her veil as soon as Jean had left the room. It was Madame Berthe Lelièvre, quite a young woman who had been married for 3 years to a large shopkeeper in the town, who was said to have married the prettiest girl in the neighborhood. She was terribly pale. Her face was contracted like the faces of mad people are occasionally, and her hands trembled violently. Twice she tried to speak, without being able to utter a sound, but at last she stammered out, 'Come, quick, quick, doctor, come, my lover has just died in my bedroom.' She stopped, half suffocated with emotion, and then went on, 'My husband will be coming home from the club very soon.' I jumped out of bed, without even considering that I was only in my nightshirt, and dressed myself in a few moments, and then I said, 'Did you come a short time ago?' 'No,' she said, standing like a statue, petrified with horror. 'It was my servant. She knows.' And then, after a short silence, she went on, 'I was there, by his side.' And she uttered a sort of cry of horror, and after a fit of choking, which made her gasp, she wept violently, and shook with spasmodic sobs for a minute or two. Then her tears suddenly ceased, as if by an internal fire, and with an air of tragic calmness she said, 'Let us make haste.' I was ready, but I exclaimed, 'I quite forgot to order my carriage.' 'I have one,' she said. 'It is his, which was waiting for him.' She wrapped herself up, so as to completely conceal her face, and we started. When she was by my side in the darkness of the carriage, she suddenly seized my hand, and crushing it in her delicate fingers, she said, with a shaking voice, that proceeded from a distracted heart, 'Oh, if you only knew, if you only knew what I'm suffering! I loved him. I have loved him distractedly, like a madwoman, for the last 6 months.' 'Is anyone up in your house?' I asked. 'No, nobody except Rose, who knows everything.' We stopped at the door, and evidently everybody was asleep, and we went in without making any noise, by means of her latchkey, and walked upstairs on tiptoe. The frightened servant was sitting on the top of the stairs with a lighted candle by her side, as she was afraid to stop by the dead man, and I went into the room, which was turned upside down, as if there had been a struggle in it. The bed, which was tumbled and open, seemed to be waiting for somebody. One of the sheets was hanging onto the floor, and wet napkins, with which they had bathed the young man's temples, were lying on the floor by the side of a wash-hand basin and a glass, while a strong smell of vinegar pervaded the room. The dead man's body was lying at full length in the middle of the room, and I went up to it, looked at it, and touched it. I opened the eyes and felt the hands, and then, turning to the two women, who were shaking as if they were frozen, I said to them, "Help me carry him onto the bed." When we had laid him gently onto it, I listened to his heart, and put a looking-glass to his lips, and then said, "It is all over. Let us make haste and dress him." It was a terrible sight. I took his limbs one by one, as if they had belonged to some enormous doll, and held them out to the clothes which the women brought, and they put on his socks, drawers, trousers, waistcoat, and lastly the coat, but it was a difficult matter to get the arms into the sleeves. When it came to buttoning his boots, the two women knelt down, while I held the light, but as his feet were rather swollen, it was very difficult, and as they could not find a button-hook, they had to use their hairpins. When the terrible toilette was over, I looked at our work and said, "You ought to arrange his hair a little." The girl went and brought her mistress's large-toothed comb and brush, but as she was trembling and pulling out his long matted hair in doing it, Madame Lelièvre took the comb out of her hand and arranged his hair as if she were caressing him. She parted it, brushed his beard, rolled his mustachios gently round her fingers, as she had no doubt been in the habit of doing in the familiarities of their intrigue. Suddenly, however, letting go of his hair, she took her dead lover's inert head in her hands, and looked for a long time in despair at the dead face, which no longer could smile at her, and then, throwing herself onto him, she took him into her arms and kissed him ardently. Her kisses fell like blows onto his closed mouth and eyes, onto his forehead and temples, and then, putting her lips to his ear, as if he could still hear her, and as if she were about to whisper something to him, to make their embraces still more ardent, she said several times in a heart-rending voice, "Adieu, my darling." Just then the clock struck 12, and I started up. "12 o'clock!" I exclaimed. "That is the time when the club closes. Come, madame, we have not a moment to lose." She started up, and I said, "We must carry him into the drawing-room." And when we had done this, I placed him on a sofa and lit the chandelier. And just then the front door was opened and shut noisily. He had come back, and I said, "Rose, bring me the basin and the towels, and make the room look tidy. Make haste, for heaven's sake. Monsieur Lelièvre is coming in." I heard his steps on the stairs, and then his hands feeling along the walls. "Come here, my dear fellow," I said. "We have had an accident." And the astonished husband appeared in the door with a cigar in his mouth, and said, "What is the matter? What is the meaning of this?" "My dear friend," I said, going up to him, "you find us in great embarrassment. I had remained late chatting with your wife and our friend, who had brought me in his carriage, when he suddenly fainted, and in spite of all we have done, he has remained unconscious for 2 hours. I did not like to call in strangers, and if you will now help me downstairs with him, I shall be able to attend to him better at his own house." The husband, who was surprised but quite unsuspicious, took off his hat, and then he took his rival, who would be quite inoffensive for the future, under his arms. I got between his two legs, as if I had been a horse between the shafts, and we went downstairs while his wife lighted us. When we got outside, I held the body up so as to deceive the coachman, and said, "Come, my friend, it is nothing. You feel better already, I expect. Pluck up your courage and make an attempt. It will soon be over." But as I felt that he was slipping out of my hands, I gave him a slap on the shoulder, which sent him forward, and made him fall into the carriage, and then I got in after him. Monsieur Lelièvre, who was rather alarmed, said to me, "Do you think it is anything serious?" To which I replied, "No," with a smile, as I looked at his wife, who had put her arm into that of her legitimate husband, and was trying to see into the carriage. I shook hands with them and told my coachman to start, and during the whole drive the dead man kept falling against me. When we got to his house, I said that he had become unconscious on the way home, and helped to carry him upstairs, where I certified that he was dead, and acted another comedy to his distracted family. and at last I got back to bed, not without swearing at lovers. The doctor ceased, though he was still smiling, and the young woman, who was in a very nervous state, said, "Why have you told me that terrible story?" He gave her a gallant bow and replied, "So that I may offer you my services if necessary." End of section 38. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista. Section 39 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Assignation. Although she had her bonnet and jacket on, with a black veil over her face, and another in her pocket, which she would put on over the other as soon as she had got into the cab, she was beating the top of her little boot with the point of her parasol, and remained sitting in her room without being able to make up her mind to keep this appointment. And yet, how many times within the last 2 years had she dressed herself thus, when she knew that her husband would be on the stock exchange, in order to go to the bachelor chambers of her lover, the handsome Vicomte de Mortalet. The clock behind her was ticking loudly. A book, which she had half read through, was lying open on a little rosewood writing table between the windows, and a strong, sweet smell of violets from 2 bunches, which were in a couple of Dresden china vases, mingled with a vague smell of verbena, which came through the half-open door of her dressing-room. The clock struck 3. She rose up from her chair. She turned round to look at herself in the glass, and smiled. "He is already waiting for me, and will be getting tired." Then she left the room, told her footman that she would be back in an hour, at the latest, which was a lie, went downstairs, and ventured into the street on foot. It was towards the end of May, that delightful time of the year, when the spring seems to be besieging Paris and to conquer it over its roofs, invading the houses through their walls, and making it look gay, shedding brightness over its stone facades, the asphalt of its pavements, the stones on the roads, bathing it and intoxicating it with sap, like a forest putting on its spring verdure. Madame Hagen went a few steps to the right, intending, as usual, to go along the Parade Provence, where she would hail a cab. But the soft air, that feeling of summer which penetrates our breast on some days, now took possession of her so suddenly that she changed her mind, and went down the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin without knowing why, but vaguely attracted by a desire to see the trees in the Square de la Trinité. "He may just wait 10 minutes longer for me," she said to herself, and that idea pleased her also as she walked slowly through the crowd. She fancied that she saw him growing impatient, looking at the clock, opening the window, listening at the door, sitting down for a few moments, getting up again, and not daring to smoke, as she had forbidden him to do so when she was coming to him, and throwing despairing looks at his box of cigarettes. She walked slowly, interested in what she saw, the shops and the people she met, walking slower and slower, and so little eager to get to her destination that she only sought for some pretext for stopping. And at the end of the street, in the little square, the verdure attracted her so much that she went in, took a chair, and, sitting down, watched the hands of the clock as they moved. Just then the half-hour struck, and her heart beat with pleasure when she heard the chimes. She had gained half an hour. Then it would take her a quarter of an hour to reach the Rue Miromesnil, and a few minutes more in strolling along. An hour, a whole hour saved from her rendezvous. She would not stop 3/4 of an hour, and that business would be finished once more. Oh, she disliked going there. Just like a patient going to the dentist, so she had the intolerable recollection of all their past meetings, one a week on average, for the last 2 years, and the thought that another was going to take place immediately made her shiver with misery from head to foot. Not that it was exactly painful, like a visit to the dentist, but it was wearisome, so complicated, so long, so unpleasant, that anything, even a visit to the dentist, would have seemed preferable to her. She went on, however, but very slowly, stopping, sitting down, going hither and thither, but she went. Oh, how she would have liked to miss this meeting! But she had left the unhappy Vicomte in the lurch twice following during the last month, and she did not dare to do it again so soon. Why did she go to see him? Oh, why? Because she had acquired the habit of doing it, and had no reason to give poor Martelet when he wanted to know the why. Why had she begun it? Why? She did not know herself any longer. Had she been in love with him? Very possibly. Not very much, but a little, a long time ago. He was very nice, sought after, perfectly dressed, most courteous, and after the first glance he was a perfect lover for a fashionable woman. He had courted her for 3 months, the normal period, an honorable strife and sufficient resistances, and then she had consented, and with what emotion, what nervousness, what terrible, delightful fear! And that first meeting in his small ground-floor bachelor rooms in the Rue des Miromesnil. Her heart? What did her little heart of a woman who had been seduced, vanquished, conquered, feel when she, for the first time, entered the door of that house which was her nightmare? She really did not know. She had quite forgotten. One remembers a fact, a date, a thing, but one hardly remembers, after the lapse of 2 years, what an emotion, which soon vanished because it was very slight, was like. But oh, she had certainly not forgotten the others, that rosary of meetings, that road to the cross of love, and those stations which were so monotonous, so fatiguing, so similar to each other, that she felt a nauseating taste in her mouth at what was going to happen so soon. And the very cabs were not like the other cabs which one makes use of for ordinary purposes. Certainly the cabmen guessed, she felt sure of it, by the very way they looked at her, and the eyes of these Paris cabmen are terrible. When one remembers they are constantly remembering, in the courts of justices, after a lapse of several years, faces of criminals whom they have only driven once, in the middle of the night, from some street or other to a railway station, and that they have to do with almost as many passengers as there are hours in the day, and that their memory is good enough for them to declare, "That is the man whom I took up in the Rue des Martyrs, and put down at the Lyons railway station at 12 o'clock at night on July 10 last year." Is it not terrible when one risks what a young woman risks when she is going to meet her lover, and has to trust her reputation to the first cabman she meets? In 2 years she had employed at least 100 to 120 in that drive to the Rue Miromesnil, reckoning only one a week, and there were so many witnesses who might appear against her at a critical moment. As soon as she was in the cab, she took another veil, which was as thick and dark as a domino mask, out of her pocket, and put it on. That hid her face. But what about the rest? Her dress, her bonnet, and her parasol? They might be remarked. They might, in fact, have been seen already. Oh, what misery she endured in this Rue des Miromesnil! She thought that she recognized all the foot passengers, the servants, everybody, and almost before the cab had stopped, she jumped out and ran past the porter who was standing outside his lodge. He must know everything, everything. Her address, her name, her husband's profession, everything, for those porters are the most cunning of policemen. For 2 years she had intended to bribe him, to give him, to throw at him one day as she passed him, 100-franc banknote, but she had never once dared to do it. She was frightened. What of, she did not know. Of his calling her back if he did not understand. Of a scandal. Of a crowd on the stairs. Of being arrested, perhaps. To reach the Vicomte's door, she had only to ascend half a flight of stairs, and it seemed to her as high as the tower of Saint Jacques' church. As soon as she had reached the vestibule, she felt as if she were caught in a trap, and the slightest noise before or behind her nearly made her faint. It was impossible for her to go back, because of that porter who barred her retreat, and if anyone came down at that moment, she would not dare to ring at Martelet's door, but would pass it as if she had been going elsewhere. She would have gone up and up and up. She would have mounted 40 flights of stairs. Then, when everything would seem quiet again down below, she would run down, feeling terribly frightened, lest she would not recognize the lobby. He was there in a velvet coat lined with silk, very stylish, but rather ridiculous. And for 2 years he had never altered his manner of receiving her, not in a single movement. As soon as he had shut the door, he used to say this: "Let me kiss your hands, my dear, dear friend." Then he followed her into the room, when, with closed shutters and lighted candles out of refinement, no doubt, he knelt down before her and looked at her from head to foot with an air of adoration. On the first occasion that had been very nice and very successful, but now it seemed to her as if she saw Monsieur Delany acting the last scene of a successful piece for the 120th time. He might really change his manner of acting, but no, he never altered his manner of acting, poor fellow. What a good fellow he was, but very commonplace. And how difficult it was to undress and dress without a lady's maid. Perhaps that was the moment when she began to take a dislike to him, when he said, "Do you want me to help you?" She could have killed him. Certainly there were not many men as awkward as he was, or as uninteresting. Certainly little Baron de Sombal would never have asked her in such a manner. "Do you want me to help you?" He would have helped her. He was so witty, so funny, so active. But there! He was a diplomatist. He had been about in the world, and had roamed everywhere, and, no doubt, dressed and undressed women who were arrayed in every possible fashion. The church clock struck the 3 quarters, and she looked at the dial and said, "Oh, how agitated he will be!" And then she quickly left the square. But she had not taken a dozen steps outside when she found herself face to face with a gentleman who bowed profoundly to her. "Why, is that you, Baron?" she said in surprise. She had just been thinking of him. "Yes, madame." And then, after asking how she was, and a few vague words, he continued, "Do you know that you are the only one, you will allow me to say of my lady friends, I hope, who has not yet seen my Japanese collection?" "But, my dear Baron, a lady cannot go to a bachelor's room like this." "What do you mean? That is a great mistake, when it is a question of seeing a rare collection. At any rate, she cannot go alone." "And why not? I have received a number of ladies alone, only for the sake of seeing my collection. They come every day. Shall I tell you their names?" "No, I will not do that. One must be discreet, even when one is not guilty. As a matter of fact, there is nothing improper in going to the house of a well-known serious man who holds a certain position, unless one goes for an unavoidable reason." "Well, what you have said is certainly correct at bottom." "So you will come and see my collection?" "When?" "Well, now, immediately." "Impossible. I am in a hurry." "Nonsense. You have been sitting in the square for this last half hour." "You were watching me?" "I was looking at you." "But I am sadly in a hurry." "I am sure you are not. Confess that you are in no particular hurry." Madame Hagen began to laugh, and said, "Well, no, not very." A cab passed close to them, and the little Baron called out, "Cabman!" And the vehicle stopped, and opening the door, he said, "Get in, madame." "But, Baron, no, it is impossible today. I really cannot." "Madame, you are acting very imprudently. Get in. People are beginning to look at us, and you will collect a crowd. They will think I am trying to carry you off, and we shall both be arrested. Please get in." She got in, frightened and bewildered, and he sat down by her side, saying to the cabman, Rue de Provence. But suddenly she exclaimed, "Good heavens! I have forgotten a very important telegram. Please drive to the nearest telegraph office first of all." The cab stopped a little farther on in the Rue des Châteaux-d'Œufs, and she said to the Baron, "Would you kindly get me a 50-centime telegraph form? I promised my husband to invite Martelet to dinner tomorrow, and had quite forgotten it." When the Baron returned and gave her the blue telegraph form, she wrote in pencil, "My dear friend, I am not at all well. I am suffering terribly from neuralgia, which keeps me in bed. Impossible to go out. Come and dine tomorrow night, so that I may obtain my pardon. Jean." She wetted the gum, fastened it carefully, and addressed it to Vicomte de Martelet, 240 Rue Miromesnil, and then, giving it back to the Baron, she said, "Now will you be kind enough to throw this into the telegram box?" End of section 39. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 40 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. An Adventure. "Come, come," Pierre Dufayel said, shrugging his shoulders. "What are you talking about when you say that there are no more adventures? Say that there are no more adventurous men, and you will be right. Yes, nobody ventures to trust to chance in these days, for as soon as there is any slight mystery, or a spice of danger, they draw back. If, however, a man is willing to go into them blindly, and to run the risk of anything that may happen, he can still meet with adventures, and even I, who never look for them, met with one in my life, and a very startling one, let me tell you. I was staying in Florence, and was living very quietly, and all I indulged in the way of adventures, was to listen occasionally to the immoral proposals with which every stranger is beset at night on the Piazza de la Signoria, by some worthy Pandarus or other, with a head like that of a venerable priest. These excellent fellows generally introduce you to their families, where debauchery is carried on in a very simple and almost patriarchal fashion, and where one does not run the slightest risk. One day, as I was admiring Benvenuto Cellini's wonderful Perseus in front of the Loggia del Lanzi, I suddenly felt my sleeve pulled somewhat roughly, and on turning round I found myself face to face with a woman of about 50, who said to me with a strong German accent, "You are French, monsieur, are you not?" "Certainly I am," I replied. "And would you like to go home with a very pretty woman?" "Most certainly I should," I replied with a laugh. Nothing could have been funnier than the looks and the serious air of the procuress, or than the strangeness of the proposal, made to broad daylight and in very bad French. But it was even worse when she added, "Do you know everything they do in Paris?" "What do you mean, my good woman?" I asked her, rather startled. "What is done in Paris that is not done everywhere else?" However, when she explained her meaning, I replied that I certainly could not, and as I was not quite so immodest as the lady, I blushed a little, but not for long, for almost immediately afterwards I grew pale, when she said, "I want to assure myself of it, personally." And she said this in the same phlegmatic manner, which did not seem so funny to me now, but on the contrary rather frightened me. "What?" I said. "Personally? You? Explain yourself." If I had been rather surprised before, I was altogether astonished at her explanation. It was indeed an adventure, and was almost like a romance. I could scarcely believe my ears, but this is what she told me. She was the confidential attendant on a lady moving in high society, who wished to be initiated into the most secret refinements of Parisian high life, and who had done me the honor of choosing me for her companion. But then this preliminary test. "By Jove," I said to myself, "this old German hag is not so stupid as she looks," and I laughed in my sleeve as I listened inattentively to what she was saying to persuade me. "My mistress is the prettiest woman you can dream of, a real beauty, Springtime, a flower. You must excuse me, but if your mistress is really like springtime and a flower, you, pray excuse me for being so blunt, are not exactly that, and perhaps I should not exactly be in a mood to humor you, my dear lady, in the same way that I might her." She jumped back, astonished in turn. "Why, I only want to satisfy myself with my own eyes, not by injuring you." And she finished her explanation, which had been incomplete before. All she had to do was to go with me to Mother Patata's well-known establishment, and there to be present, while I conversed with one of its fair and frail inhabitants. "Oh," I said to myself, "I was mistaken in her tastes. She is, of course, an old shriveled-up woman, as I guessed, but she is a specialist. This is interesting, upon my word. I never met with such a one before. Here, gentlemen, I must beg you to allow me to hide my face for a moment. What I said was evidently not strictly correct, and I am rather ashamed of it. My excuse must be that I was young, that Patata's was a celebrated place of which I had heard wonderful things said, but the entry to which was barred me on account of my small means. 5 Napoleons was the price. Fancy! I could not treat myself to it, and so I accepted the good lady's offer. I do not say that it was not disagreeable, but what was I to do? And then the old woman was a German, and so her 5 Napoleons were a slight return for our 5 milliards, which we paid them as our war indemnity. Well, Patata's boarder was charming, the old woman was not too troublesome, and your humble servant did his best to sustain the ancient glory of Frenchmen. Let me drink my disgrace to the dregs. On the next day, but one after, I was waiting at the statue of Perseus. It was shameful, I confess, but I enjoyed the partial restitution of the 5 milliards, and it is surprising how a Frenchman loses his dignity when he is traveling. The good lady made her appearance at the appointed time. It was quite dark, and I followed her without a word, for after all, I was not very proud of the part I was playing. But if you only knew how fair that little girl at Patata's was! As I went along, I thought only of her, and did not pay any attention to where we were going, and I was only roused from my reverie by hearing the old woman say, "Here we are. Try and be as entertaining as you were the day before yesterday." We were not outside Patata's house, but in a narrow street running by the side of a palace with high walls, and in front of us was a small door which the old woman opened gently. For a moment I felt inclined to draw back. Apparently the old hag was also ardent on her own account. She had me in a trap. No doubt she wanted, in her turn, to make use of my small talents. But no, that was impossible. Go in," she said. "What are you afraid of? My mistress is so pretty, much prettier than the little girl of the other day." So it was really true, this story out of the Arabian Nights. Why not? And after all, what was I risking? The good old woman would certainly not injure me, and so I went in, though somewhat nervously. Oh, my friend, what an hour I spent then! Paradise! And it would be useless, impossible to describe it to you. Apartments fit for a princess, and one of those princesses out of fairy tales, a fairy herself. An exquisite German woman, exquisite as German women can be, when they try. An Undine of Heinrich Heine's, with hair like the Virgin Mary's, innocent blue eyes, and a skin like strawberries and cream. Suddenly, however, my Undine got up, and her face convulsed with fury and pride. Then she rushed behind some hangings, where she began to give vent to a flood of German words which I did not understand, while I remained standing, dumbfounded. But just then the old woman came in and said, shaking with fear, "Quick, quick, dress yourself and go, if you do not wish to be killed." I asked no questions, for what was the good of trying to understand? Besides, the old woman, who grew more and more terrified, could not find any French words, and chattered wildly. I jumped up and got into my shoes and overcoat, and ran down the stairs and in the street. 10 minutes later I recovered my breath and my senses without knowing what streets I had been through, nor where I had come from, and I stole furtively into my hotel as if I had been a malefactor. In the cafés the next morning nothing was talked of except a crime that had been committed during the night. A German baron had killed his wife with a revolver, but he had been liberated on bail, as he had appealed to his counsel, to whom he had given the following explanation, to the truth of which the lady companion of the Baroness had certified. She had been married to her husband almost by force, and detested him, and she had some particular reasons, which were not specified, for her hatred of him. In order to have her revenge on him, she had had him seized, bound, and gagged by 4 hired ruffians, who had been caught and who had confessed everything. Thus reduced to immobility, and unable to help himself, the Baron had been obliged to witness a degrading scene where his wife caressed a Frenchman, and thus outraged conjugal fidelity and German honor at the same time. As soon as he was set at liberty, the Baron had punished his faithless wife, and was now seeking her accomplice. "And what did you do?" someone asked Pierre Dufayel. "The only thing I could do, by George," he replied. "I put myself at the poor devil's disposal. It was his right, and so we fought a duel. Alas, it was with swords, and he ran me right through the body. That was also his right, but he exceeded his right when he called me her Ponce. Then I gave him his chance, and as I fell, I called out with all the strength that remained to me, 'A Frenchman! A Frenchman! Long live France!'" End of section 40. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 41 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Double Pins. Ah, my dear fellow, what jades women are! What makes you say that? Because they have played me an abominable trick. You? Yes, me. Women or a woman? 2 women. 2 women at once? Yes. What was the trick? The 2 young men were sitting outside a café on the boulevards and drinking liqueurs mixed with water, those aperients which look like infusions of all the shades in a box of watercolors. They were nearly the same age, 25 to 30. One was dark and the other fair, and they had the same semi-elegant look of stock jobbers, of men who go to the stock exchange and into drawing rooms, who are to be seen everywhere, who live everywhere and love everywhere. The dark one continued: "I have told you of my connection with that little woman, a tradesman's wife, whom I met on the beach at Dieppe." "Yes." "My dear fellow, you know what it is. I had a mistress in Paris, whom I loved dearly, an old friend, a good friend, and it has grown into a habit, in fact, and I value it very much." "Your habit?" "Yes, my habit, and hers also. She is married to an excellent man, whom I also value very much, a very cordial fellow, a capital companion. I may say I think that my life is bound up with that house." "Well?" "Well, they could not manage to leave Paris, and I found myself a widower at Dieppe." "Why did you go to Dieppe?" "For change of air. One cannot remain on the boulevards the whole time." "And then?" "Then I met the little woman I mentioned to you on the beach there." "The wife of that head of the public office?" "Yes. She was dreadfully dull. Her husband only came every Sunday, and he is horrible. I understand her perfectly, and we laughed and danced together." "And the rest?" "Yes, but that came later. However, we met. We liked each other. I told her I liked her, and she made me repeat it, so that she might understand it better, and she put no obstacles in my way." "Did you love her?" "Yes, a little. She is very nice." "And what about the other?" The other was in Paris. Well, for 6 weeks it was very pleasant, and we returned here on the best of terms. Do you know how to break with a woman when that woman has not wronged you in any way? Yes, perfectly well. How do you manage it? I give her up. How do you do it? I do not see her any longer. But supposing she comes to you? I am not at home. And if she comes again? I say I am not well. If she looks after you? I play her some dirty trick. And if she puts up with it? I write to her husband anonymous letters, so that he may look after her on the days that I expect her. That is serious. I cannot resist, and do not know how to bring about a rupture, and so I have a collection of mistresses. There are some whom I do not see more than once a year, others every 10 months, others on those days when they want to dine at a restaurant. Those whom I have put at regular intervals do not worry me, but I often have great difficulty with the fresh ones, so as to keep them at proper intervals. And then, this little woman was all fire and flame, without any fault of mine, as I told you. As her husband spends all the whole day at his office, she began to come to me unexpectedly, and twice she nearly met my regular one on the stairs. The devil! Yes. So I gave each of them her days, regular days, to avoid confusion. Saturday and Monday for the old one, Tuesday, Friday, and Sunday for the new one. Why did you show her the preference? Ah, my dear friend, she is younger. So that only gave you 2 days to yourself in a week. That is enough for one. Allow me to compliment you on that. Well, just fancy that the most ridiculous and most annoying thing in the world happened to me. For 4 months everything had been going on perfectly. I felt perfectly safe, and I was really very happy, when suddenly, last Monday, the crash came. I was expecting my regular one at the usual time, 1:15, and was smoking a good cigar and dreaming, very well satisfied with myself, when I suddenly saw that it was past the time, at which I was much surprised, for she is very punctual, but I thought that something might have accidentally delayed her. However, half an hour passed, then an hour and a half, and then I knew that something must have detained her. A sick headache, perhaps, or some annoying visitor. That sort of waiting is very vexatious, that useless waiting, very annoying and enervating. At last I made up my mind to go out, and not knowing what to do, I went to her, and found her reading a novel. "Well," I said to her, and she replied quite calmly, "My dear, I could not come. I was hindered." "How?" "My something else." "What was it?" "A very annoying visit." I saw that she would not tell me the true reason, and as she was very calm, I did not trouble myself any more about it, and hoped to make up for lost time with the other the next day. And on the Tuesday I was very, very excited, and amorous in expectation of the public official's little wife, and I was surprised that she had not come before the appointed time, and I looked at the clock every moment, and watched the hands impatiently, but the quarter passed, then the half hour, then 2 o'clock. I could not sit still any longer, and walked up and down very soon in great strides, putting my face against the window and my ears to the door, to listen whether she was not coming upstairs. 2:30, 3 o'clock, I seized my hat and rushed to her house. She was reading a novel, my dear fellow. "Well?" I said, anxiously, and she replied as calmly as usual, "I was hindered and could not come." "By what?" "An annoying visit." Of course, I immediately thought that they both knew everything, but she seemed so calm and quiet that I set aside my suspicions, and thought it was only some strange coincidence, as I could not believe in such dissimulation on her part. And so, after half an hour's friendly talk, which was, however, interrupted a dozen times by her little girl coming in and out of the room, I went away very much annoyed. Just imagine the next day. The same thing happened? Yes, and the next also. And that went on for 3 weeks without any explanation, without anything explaining that strange conduct to me, the secret of which I suspected, however. They knew everything? I should think so, by George, but how? Ah, I had a great deal of anxiety before I found it out. How did you manage it at last? From their letters, for on the same day they both gave me their dismissal in identical terms. Well, this is how it was. You know that women always have an array of pens about them. I know hairpins. I doubt them and look after them, but the others are much more treacherous. Those confounded little black-headed pens, which look all alike to us, great fools that we are, but which they can distinguish, just as we can distinguish a horse from a dog. Well, it appears that one day my minister's little wife left one of those telltale instruments pinned to the paper, close to my looking-glass. My usual one had immediately seen this little black speck, no bigger than a flea, and had taken it out without saying a word, and then had left one of her pens, which was also black, but of a different pattern, in the same place. The next day the minister's wife wished to recover her property, and immediately recognized the substitution. Then her suspicions were aroused, and she put in 2 and crossed them, and my original one replied to this telegraphic signal by 3 black pellets, one on top of the other. And as soon as this method had begun, they continued to communicate with each other without saying a word, only to spy on each other. Then it appears that the regular one, being bolder, wrapped a tiny piece of paper round the little wire point, and wrote upon it, C. D. Poste Restante, Boulevards Malherbe. Then they wrote to each other. You understand that was not everything that passed between them. They set to work with precaution, with 1,000 stratagems, with all the prudence that is necessary in such cases. But the regular one did a bold stroke, and made an appointment with the other. I do not know what they said to each other. All that I know is that I had to pay the costs of their interview. There, you have it all. Is that all? Yes. And do you not see them any more? I beg your pardon. I see them as friends, for we have not quarreled altogether. And have they met again? Yes, my dear fellow, they have become intimate friends. And has not that given you an idea? No. What idea? You, great booby. The idea of making them put back the pins where they found them. End of section 41. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista.